Welcome to the Programming Step-by-Step video tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to cover all the steps that you need to follow in order to write a program from start to finish. So this resource is going to be really helpful for any of the clusters within your course that contain anything to do with program writing. So let's have a look at those clusters that this resource applies to. We've got a list here of all the different units that might or might not be within your particular enrollment. And these are the units or clusters where this resource is going to come in really handy, and it's something that you can follow because it provides you with the steps that you need to go through from A to Z in terms of writing a program, and then you can apply this to any demographic, any age group, any ability level, any fitness level. So starting from the start, we have a look at step number 1. And this step is all about establishing the client's goal and then relating that goal to some of the programming principles. So there's 4 main principles in programming. Those are shown on the screen here. So you've got frequency, intensity, time, and type. So frequency is really basic. It's just how often you think the client should exercise per week. Then intensity is the workload or effort the client would expend during an exercise session. And we measure this using a percentage of 1 repetition maximum or percentage of heart rate maximum. And if you're not sure what those are, that's fine. We'll spend a bit of time on slides that are coming up talking about what those things are. Then we move on to time. Time is the duration of a program or an individual session. So it can refer to just one session or an overall program or weekly amount of exercise. And then finally, we've got type. So this is the type of exercise we want to program for the client based on what their goal is. And it could be cardiovascular conditioning, could be resistance training, it could be flexibility, or any combination of those 3. So let's have a look at each one of these principles in a little bit more detail now. So this is looking at all the individual factors that are going to affect frequency of training for your client. So the first one is availability. So we can have a plan for the client and we might want them to train 5 times a week, but if they're a busy person, they've got a full-time job, they've got family commitments or outside work commitments, and they can only commit to 1 or 2 sessions per week, then that obviously affects the type of training we give to them. So we must work within the client's schedule constraints. And next is their preferences. So the client may have a preference to do a different number of sessions than what you'd ideally have for them. And, we can't make them do something. We can make suggestions, but ultimately we have to work within the constraints of the client and what their preferences are too. So they might not want to do a particular type of exercise, and we must listen to that and take that into consideration when we're basically developing that program. Then we've got their fitness levels. So there's going to be a big difference in the capacity for exercise between someone who's a beginner and someone who's an advanced client. So using this information, we might have a beginner adopt a slightly smaller frequency of exercise initially. And then over time, as their fitness levels increase, we can give them a higher volume. So we might go from 1 to 2 sessions per week, and then eventually work our way up to 5 or 6 or whatever that number needs to be for that client. Then we've got the type of training. So some types of training may require, more or less frequency. So if you consider something that's, high intensity or high impact, like plyometric based sessions or jumping around and that sort of thing, we might have a lower overall frequency of sessions because we might not want that client doing that every single day of the week. Whereas if it's a lower intensity or lower impact exercise, maybe it's just, a brisk walk around the neighborhood or something like that, then there's really, for most people, there's no reason why they can't do that most, if not all days of the week. So just have a think about the type of training you want that client to do and what that impact would be on how many sessions a week they could do that for safely. Then we have medical advice. So the general principle that you'll follow for any client that requires medical advice is that we must follow what those recommendations are provided by either the medical or allied health professional. So if their GP has told them to do, low or moderate intensity, we must follow that. or if the physio has said, avoid this particular movement for this time frame, then we must follow that, because we as personal trainers are not able to diagnose and not able to work with high-risk population groups unless we follow guidance based on their medical or allied health professionals. Moving on from frequency now, we'll have a look at intensity. And intensity is different based on the type of session you're programming. But first of all, we'll have a look at just resistance training. So this refers to, machine weights, free weights, or even body weight resistance style of exercise. So for this style, we measure intensity, or we program intensity using percentage of 1 rep max, so percentage of 1 RM. And hopefully you've seen that term used before. So 1 RM is basically just the maximum weight a person can lift for 1 repetition only. So for example, we've got this client and the maximum weight that they can squat for 1 repetition is 100 kilos. So what would their 1 RM be in that case? What's 100 kilos, because that's the maximum weight they can lift. So you can establish someone's 1 rep max through testing protocols, but you have to consider that a 1 rep max, because it's the maximum weight that they can lift, that does carry a slightly elevated increased injury risk, especially if someone isn't conditioned to that exercise. So while testing 1 RMs is perfectly fine, depending on the scenario, it's generally more suited to advanced or well-trained clients, and we'd only use it where relevant. So if someone has a very specific goal that they want to increase their squat 1 repetition maximum by whatever amount within a certain time frame, it may be suitable for that client to test them at point A and point B. But if you've got a beginner client who doesn't have a solid training background behind them, you have to consider if a 1 rep max is actually a suitable or safe testing method for them. Because there are actually alternatives. So you can do a 5 repetition maximum or a 10 repetition maximum as different fitness tests. And obviously because they're at a lower, overall load or weight being lifted, they are usually considered to be a safer form of testing. And from those numbers, there are actually formulas that exist that you can use to predict that person's 1 repetition maximum without ever having them, actually do that 1 repetition maximum test. And we've got some names of those tests on the screen here. So as you can see on the diagram on the right, the right-hand column shows the percentage of 1 rep maximum that relates to the different goals in the left-hand column. So for strength, we can see maximum strength. The 1 repetition maximum has to be quite high, so 93 to 100% in that case. For general strength, we're looking at 85 to 90%. Hypertrophy, which is muscle gain, 66 to 83% approximately. And then muscular endurance is 50 to 65%. Now finally, power is a little bit different. So power just refers to moving a weight over a distance in the shortest period of time. So Olympic weightlifting is a good example of power exercise. So because you have to lift that weight at quite a rapid speed, generally the training for that is performed at submaximal loads, so below 100% 1 repetition maximum, because this is where the highest power output can be seen. And usually that's at a lower load, like 30 to 60% 1 RM, because the weight is lower, you can move the bar or the weight a lot faster. But you can train it up to 90% for low or single repetition efforts. So we use this intensity scale, this percentage of 1 repetition maximum, in any resistance program that we're writing. And the different numbers that you can see along this table basically determine the type of adaptation or improvement that relate to the client's goals. So obviously if the client's goal is to improve their muscular endurance, we wouldn't give them a program, at maximum strength range because it doesn't relate to their goal. As we touched on the previous slide, different percentage of 1 RM values correlate to different goals or different fitness outcomes for the client. So let's look at an example here. If a client's goal is hypertrophy, which is another word for muscle gain, what should their intensity be? So having a look at this diagram on the right-hand side, the hypertrophy intensities are 66 to 83% 1 repetition maximum. So that's the range of intensity that you get the greatest benefits in terms of hypertrophy. Now, just as the intensity changes and we get different fitness outcomes for the client, what also changes along with that intensity are the number of repetitions and number of sets that are most suited for that intensity number. So just as a recap for what these terms mean, so reps or repetitions is the number of times the movement or exercise is done within a set. So if you're doing a set of bicep curls and you're doing 10 repetitions, it's 10 bicep curls until you rest and you move on to the next set or the next exercise. And the set refers to the number of times an exercise is repeated, and it's usually separated, especially within resistance training, with rest in between each set. So 3 lots of 10 would be 3 sets of 10 repetitions with rest in between usually. So we can see here in this table that if we pick a fitness outcome, so muscular endurance, for example, we've got a bunch of different numbers that are carrying across. So the first column we can see is the intensity, so the percentage of 1 repetition maximum. And say for a client, we deem it suitable that they can do 65%, 1 repetition maximum. If we follow it across, 65% 1 RM requires a number of repetitions of 15. So if we were to go up the column, so moving up into hypertrophy, we can see the number of repetitions is lower than what we see in endurance. And that's because there's an inverse relationship between intensity and repetitions. And all that means is that the higher the intensity, the lower the number of possible repetitions. So looking up at 100% 1 RM, someone's maximum lift, they can only do it for 1 repetition. But as this intensity number reduces down here, we can see the number of reps goes up accordingly. So they oppose each other essentially. As one goes up, the other comes down. So as intensity increases, the number of reps decreases. And as the number of reps increase, the intensity decreases. Hopefully haven't lost you there. But if you have a look at the table, I guess, in a bit more detail, pause the slide if you need to, you'll see how that relationship occurs. Moving across into sets. So generally, if you're looking at maximum strength, you can see it has a higher number of sets than some of the other fitness goals that appear below it. So usually that one of the main reasons that occurs is because we're doing a lower number of repetitions per set because the weight is a lot heavier. We can only lift it a couple of times. So to counteract that, most of the time we will adopt a higher number of sets so that because our rep numbers are lower, we're doing more reps over a larger number of sets instead of more repetitions per set. So these are just guidelines here, but these number of sets is going to be heavily, impacted on based on your client's preferences and things like how long the session actually goes for. So you might not be able to do 5 sets of a one exercise because you don't have the time to do that. Another component that will impact the duration of your session and your overall programming will be the rest between sets. So we can see there is also a significant difference in the amount of rest between sets depending on what the goal is. So for any strength outcomes, the rest periods are generally a lot higher than those in hypertrophy or endurance. And that's because the weight is so much heavier that we need more recovery between sets to allow us to do multiple sets and repeat that effort each time. So if we do, a near maximal lift, and we only rest for 60 seconds or less, then we don't have the recovery to be able to go and repeat that effort again. Then opposing that, we've got, muscular endurance down here. We can see the rest periods are a lot lower, and that's generally because the weight being lifted is lower, and we can generally get away with a shorter rest period. And because that rest period is shorter, we might be able to do more within that session, whether that's, more exercises or more sets of the exercises that we program for them. Now we've got this table here, and this table is a really handy resource that you guys can use when you're writing any program that involves any resistance training. So the benefit of this table is that we can see exactly for which intensity, which percentage of 1 RM, the number of repetitions that we need to program for them. And we can also see what the primary fitness goal is for each of those percentage of 1 repetition maximums. But the cool thing about this table is that it also shows the secondary fitness goals that might also occur at any given number. So there's often times where at certain 1RM numbers, different goals or multiple goals are occurring for that client. So they're adapting in multiple ways, essentially. So even if we're training for strength, we can still achieve secondary adaptations to things like muscle hypertrophy or muscle growth, for example. So this is evident more so at the lower end of strength, such as around 85% 1 rep max, where we can see, while strength is occurring here, we're also getting some other beneficial improvements in terms of the size of the muscle. And if we compare that to some of the higher intensity strength ranges, the main outcome or most of the beneficial improvements are just going to be related to strength and less so for muscle gain. So the point is that at any given intensity, there isn't only a single adaptation that would occur. And clients would usually increase or maintain their strength even at lower intensities. So if we look at 60% 1 RM down here, so the main goal is muscular endurance, but because we're improving the endurance of the target muscles, we're not necessarily reducing in strength. We might maintain those levels, but primarily we're training those muscles to repeatedly contract over a longer period of time. So we might achieve some strength improvements even down at this intensity, but it's not going to be the same extent of strength improvement that we would get if we were to expose that client to strength-specific training, like at the top here. So if we can follow this down, we can see the different beneficial improvements that are likely to occur at different intensities. And sometimes, around the middle of the table, so 75% 1 repetition maximum, the main goal is hypertrophy, but we'll still likely receive some strength and some endurance outcomes there as well. So this table also highlights some of the issues that we commonly see in programming. So if we have a look at the slide here, we've got a bit of a question for you to answer. So in this example, this client is doing 90% 1 repetition maximum for 8 repetitions. So if you just pause the slide if you want to and have a look at that and see if you can work out what the error is here. Right, so now you've had a look at it. The issue with 90% 1 RM for 8 repetitions is that it's not possible, because if we follow the number across, the number of repetitions possible at 90% is only 4. So if you write a program for 90% 1 RM for 8 repetitions, it will be returned to say basically, that's not a possible intensity and rep combination. So only 4 is possible at that number. Now, example number 2, we'll go through the same process. So in this case, we've got 65% 1 RM for 7 repetitions. So if you want to have a pause of the slide and just have a look at that and see if there's any issues with that one. So now you've had a look at it, we can see that at 65%, it is possible to do 7 repetitions, but it's also possible that 15 is achievable. So if you've got, relatively low intensity, like 65%, if you only gave the client 7 repetitions, then it's very likely that exercise will be very easy for them to do because the weight is light and you're also giving them a low number of repetitions to perform. So for the most improvement to occur at that intensity number, we must give them a volume that matches. So 15 repetitions in this example. So generally speaking, if you're using this table, the best way to do it would be to always match the repetition number to the intensity column. If those numbers don't match or there's a significant difference between them, there's likely going to be an issue in the program. Now, it's not always the case where you'd need to have them match, perfectly. There are definitely some scenarios where you might want the exercise itself to be a little bit easier for the client, such as, maybe for someone doing the very first session of resistance training. So we might, lower the volume or lower the number of reps to make it a little bit easier. But generally speaking, it's always best to have those numbers match up. Otherwise, it's either not possible or it might be too easy for that client to perform that exercise. So now we've had a look at intensity for resistance training, we'll have a look at cardiovascular intensity now. Cardiovascular intensity is measured or programmed using percentage of maximum heart rate, and we abbreviate that down to percentage MHR. And all this means is that it's the highest possible heart rate that an individual can achieve. So looking at this diagram here on the right, we can see we've got different ranges of intensities and how they correspond to different fitness levels and different energy consumption characteristics as well. First of all, with the beginner fitness level, so it's a lower intensity, so 50 to 70% maximum heart rate. And what it means here is that it's a lower heart rate, but it's using an energy system called the aerobic system that's very efficient at producing energy. And therefore, it can be sustained over a long period of time. And similarly, 70 to 80% maximum heart rate would use predominantly the aerobic system. So we can see here that there's some terms used. So you might see these particular heart rates or ranges associated with, the fat burning zone. Bit of a keyword there, or a bit of an industry buzzword. And it's not that you're not producing, fat burning benefits at different heart rates. It's just that in this intensity range, that is a primary source of fuel. As we move up to higher intensities, so looking at 80 to 100% maximum heart rate, we start to use a different energy system primarily, and that's the anaerobic, so without oxygen system. So this system is very effective at producing energy quickly for exercise, but it's not efficient, so it can't be sustained for a long period of time like lower intensities can. So we've got these energy stores that we can, rapidly use for high intensity bursts or efforts, but they don't last as long essentially as aerobic energy pathways. So quick energy, but not long duration energy. So looking at maximum heart rate, so 90 to 100% down here, this is something you'd usually associate with something like interval training, where you've got, say, for example, 30 seconds of maximum intensity, followed by 30 seconds of rest. So because we're having a lot of rest compared to the exercise we're doing, we're allowing those inefficient energy pathways to recover so that we can then repeat that maximum intensity effort. And if we didn't have that rest in between, we just simply can't maintain that for a long period of time, like we could if we were doing a lower intensity exercise. So when we're trying to calculate a person's maximum heart rate, there's a very simple formula that's most commonly used. It's not 100% accurate, but it will give you pretty close estimate of what someone's maximum heart rate is. And it's very simple. It's just 220 minus the person's age. And that should tell you around about what their maximum heart rate actually is. So for example, we've got this 40-year-old person. So to calculate their maximum heart rate, we would take 220 minus their age, which is 40, and that equates to 180 beats per minute. So then what we can use with that number, that 180, that's the maximum heart rate for that person, we can calculate different heart rate zones that we want them to be in based on, what type of benefit they're trying to achieve, what their fitness level is, and things of that nature. So for example, 50% maximum heart rate for that client would be, the easiest way to work it out down the bottom here is you take their maximum heart rate number and multiply it by 0.5, which represents 50%. And that gives you 90 beats per minute here. So you're probably well aware that 90 beats per minute is not very high. So you might get to that point with a very slow jog or a brisk walk. And so you'd have to consider if 50% maximum heart rate is ideal for that client. So if you've got someone with an average fitness level or high fitness level, 50% maximum heart rate is going to be very, very easy for that person. It's going to be a very, just a walk around the park or a walk up a hill or something like that. If we have a look at the next example down, 70%. So to work this out, you would take their maximum heart rate of 180 and multiply it by 0.7. It's just the easiest way to get there. And that gives you 126 beats per minute. And you know that 126 beats per minute, you actually, you're starting to work a bit harder there. You're probably breathing faster. You can feel your heart beating around. And so that's obviously a higher intensity. And then finally, 90% maximum heart rate. Do the same process, 180 times 0.9, and it gives you 162 beats per minute. And you can see that 162 beats per minute for that person is very close to their maximum of 180. So at that point, it's going to be quite an intense exercise for them, and likely an exercise that they can't sustain for a long period of time. So maybe even 30 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes, something like that. We've had a look now already at intensity across both cardiovascular and resistance training. So now let's have a look at a method we can use to gauge intensity or to help determine intensity during a session. So what we've got here on the screen is the RPE scale, and that stands for Rating of Perceived Exertion. And it's a scale normally used from 0 to 10 that describes a person's effort during exercise. So 0 being nothing at all, and 10 being the maximum effort they can put in. Now you will sometimes see a different scale used. It's called the modified RPE scale, and it goes from 6 to 20. And it does so because in theory, if you were to multiply whatever number they're at, so at 6, for example, by 10, then you'd get their estimated heart rate at that point, or what their heart rate should be if they were at that level. So someone at a 6 out of 20, you multiply that 6 by 10, you get 60 beats per minute, and 6 would be very easy for them. In general, most commonly we use the 0 to 10 scale because it's easier for clients to understand. So if you ask them, from 0 to 10, how hard are you working? They'll know pretty much straight away what you mean. Whereas if you ask them, between 6 and 20, how hard are you working? They'll be confused by those numbers. So the key word in this scale is perceived exertion. So it's not exactly necessarily how hard they're working, because their perception of an exercise or whatever movement they're doing is very individualized, and it's very much influenced by a large number of factors. So for example, their mood, if they're in a bad mood, they might give you a higher RPE scale number than what they would otherwise if they were in a good mood. If they have a bad attitude toward a particular exercise, so for example, if someone really hates burpees and they're doing them very slowly and at a low speed, low intensity, they might give you a higher RPE number than what you would expect because they just don't like the exercise. And unfortunately, even their attitudes towards us as the trainers can impact their perception of RPE. So if they like you, they might tell you a number that you want to hear. They might give you a lower number than what they're actually working. Or on the other side, if you're a new trainer, you're coming in, taking over someone's group or taking over someone's client, they haven't formed that bond with you yet, then they might give you a different number altogether. So they might be working at a lower intensity, but they give you a higher number instead. And even environmental factors. So there's so many things that influence RPE, but something like temperature would be a good one. So if it's it's a hot day, their body temperature is getting up, but they're still only working at a low intensity, they might give you an unexpectedly high RPE scale number. Even things like the music playing, if they don't like the music, that can influence the RPE. So these are all individual variances, but generally, RPE scale is going to give you a really good indication of how hard it is for the client perceives themselves to be working. And you use this number or these numbers to sort of gauge if the program you've written for them is suitable. So if you've given them a relatively easy exercise or what you think is easy, it should be easy for them, but they tell you they're working at, RPE 9 out of 10, then that's a concern for you because those two don't match up. So if you've anticipated them to be working at a 5 or a 6 and they're at a 9, something's off. So either the program's too difficult, or maybe they're in a bad mood. Maybe it's really hot. Maybe they don't like you. All these things come into it when we're looking at RPE scale. Let's move on from intensity now and look at step number 2, which is exercise order and selection. So exercise ordering just refers to the sequencing of our individual exercises within any session. And there's a few general rules that we would follow that sort of guide us in what's best practice to do in terms of ordering our exercises when we're writing a program. The first rule to follow would be to do our heaviest exercise first and our lightest towards the end. So let's compare these two exercises. We've got the deadlift and the hamstring curl. So our deadlift will always involve a higher weight that we can lift with that exercise because it's using more muscle groups and involving more moving joints than if we compare it to a hamstring curl, which is, a single moving joint and a smaller muscle group. So we would do the deadlift before the hamstring curl 99 times out of 100. Our next rule is to do compound exercise before isolation. So just briefly, compound movements are those that involve multiple moving joints, and because of that, they use more muscle mass compared to isolation, which are single moving joints and usually smaller muscle groups. So lat pull down compared to a bicep curl. So we do the lat pull down first. Even though the biceps are a helper or synergist muscle in a lat pull down, we've also got many other muscle groups that assist in that exercise. So that's why we do the lat pull down before the bicep curl. So if we do the bicep curl first, there's potential we fatigue one of those muscle groups that is going to be, a synergist or a helper in the lat pull down. And it means that our performance would be reduced and the weight in the lat pull down would be lower potentially if we pre-fatigue those muscle groups. And then finally, we have the goals of the client. So we must factor in client goals to the session design. So if, for example, they wanted to primarily improve their cardiovascular fitness, but do a little bit of weight training on the side, we'd prioritize their main goal first. So we put most of our energy into the main goal. So we do the cardiovascular movements first, then we might finish on the weight training towards the end. Then we have exercise selection. So some of these we've just touched on, but it just refers to which exercises we want to select for that client to put in their program. And again, there's some general rules here that apply. So we select the exercise that provides the most benefits. So the best bang for their buck and the most effective use of the time that you've got available. So with this compound versus isolation, we just talked about before. So to expand on that, compound exercises are those that involve large muscle groups and that have multiple moving joints in the exercise. And these are more meaningful than isolation movements because we can promote more significant adaptations than isolation exercises can achieve. And the benefits are more significant or greater simply because we're using more muscles within that exercise, more moving joints. Generally, it's going to be a heavier movement. So we're providing more of a stimulus to the body to allow it to make those beneficial improvements, whether that's weight loss or strength increase or muscle size increase. Whatever the movement is, the benefits will be more meaningful to the client. But if we compare that to isolation, which is smaller muscle groups and usually only a single moving joint, then obviously because we're using smaller muscle groups and less of them, the benefits are therefore limited. So we must consider if isolation exercises are relevant to the client's goals. So it's not always the case that compound exercises only will be used in a program. Generally speaking, compound exercises are far more effective at achieving client goals. But if there's a case where, for example, maybe the client had an injury from a long time ago, and now, they've got less strength on one arm compared to the other, or one leg compared to the other. That can be a time where we might use isolation movements to help improve that strength differential between the limbs. But it's not always the case that we wouldn't do isolation, but generally speaking, especially in a short duration session, such as 30 or 45 minutes, we likely would do compound movements only just because they're far more effective. We've got an example here. So on the left here, we've got a barbell row, and on the right, we've got a barbell bicep curl. And the red obviously just highlights all the individual muscles or muscle groups that are involved in that exercise. So in the row, you can see that the whole posterior trunk essentially is involved, the back of the shoulder, and it doesn't show in this diagram, but the biceps are still involved in this movement. They're a synergist muscle. They help with the movement. Compared to the bicep curl, where just essentially the bicep and a couple of the smaller muscle groups that help to flex the elbow are involved as well. So you've got far more muscle mass being recruited in the row compared to the curl. So it's a far more effective and efficient use of time, and it will help to achieve client goals faster than isolation. Let's go through a few more examples to help cement that knowledge in. So our first example is a squat, which is the compound movement, versus the isolation comparison, which is a leg extension. So in terms of which one's more effective, the squat is a more effective exercise for the reasons being that we recruit significantly more muscle mass than what we would do in the leg extension. So they both target the quads, but in the squat, we also target other significant muscle groups or large muscle groups like gluteus maximus, the gluteals in general. We also have a lot of different helper muscles, which are called synergists, that help to either, perform the joint movement or to stabilize the joints. And we also have it being more effective because we've got multiple moving joints. So in the leg extension, we've only got the knee as the moving joint. Whereas in the squat, we've got knee, hip, ankle, even spine involvement as well. So in terms of functionality, which exercise is going to be more functional? Well, that one's easy because the squat is an everyday movement that we all do. So something like getting up out of a chair is essentially a squat. Now, that's a really important movement, especially for older adults, to maintain, their freedom and to be able to perform their activities of daily living. Now, our next example is an upper body comparison, and we looked at this one on the previous slide. So just to put it down, on paper here, if we compare the seated row, which is like a machine version of that barbell row we saw before, compared to a bicep curl, which is an isolation exercise. Just compare the amount of muscle recruitment involved in a row compared to a bicep curl. And then we also have a lot of different joints involved in the row compared to the bicep curl. And for these reasons, obviously the row is going to be a far more effective exercise. And we still do target the biceps in a row movement. So it's just a far more effective use of client time, especially when we look at most sessions these days being 30 to 45 minutes. So if you spend, your first two exercises are a bicep curl and a tricep extension, you've pretty much used up half your session already. So just think about how can you promote the most benefits, or what's the most effective and efficient use of the client's time and your time when you're writing these programs for them. And just to recap on the previous information, we prioritize compound over isolation movements generally for the following reasons. First being they recruit more muscle mass during an exercise. We expend more energy to perform that exercise because we have more muscles involved and more joints moving. And therefore we experience greater results, or the client experiences greater results as a result of point 1 and 2. And finally, they're usually more functional as well. And they usually are exercises that help to replicate some of the important everyday movements we need to be able to do our activities of daily living. Now let's have a look at some common exercise selections, and this is a resource that you'll find within the Programming Step-by-Step PDF version. of this presentation. And first of all, we're going to look at progressions. So progression is essentially just a more difficult or more advanced version of an exercise. And it's usually more difficult because it's a more technical movement. It's less stable potentially. It has a higher intensity, or it might involve a greater range of motion. And then opposing that, we've got regressions. So regressions are just the opposite of progression, and they're a less difficult or easier version of an exercise. So we have a table here within your attachment, your PDF version, and it goes through an extensive list of different progression and regressions of common everyday movements or everyday exercises that we would put into programs. So let's have a look at progressions first of all. So in the first column, down the left-hand side here, we've got the primary movement, and they're broken down into different categories such as lower body push or lower body pull movements. So let's consider the squat, for example, number 1. So the squat, there's a couple really obvious ways to progress it, and this would be by adding load. And this is generally a rule you'd apply across any exercise. Adding more load or adding a load in the first place is a progression. And we can add load through dumbbell or barbell variations of the squat. But generally speaking, the dumbbell is the first place you would go to, build up from there, then progress to the barbell squat. But there's also a number of different ways you can progress that movement as well. So you can actually make the exercise more difficult by making it a single leg version, which is like a pistol squat or single leg squat. Or you could make it a more plyometric based exercise. So that would be something like a jump squat. Another option also could be through increasing the range of motion. So if you can progress the depth at which someone can squat, that's a very valuable progression because you're working through a larger range of motion. And like you might often see people who don't squat a lot, or they might be relatively weak at the hip or knees. They might be able to do, a pretty good squat, but only to a limited depth. So over time, you might work them through a larger range of motion and get them to the point where you're happy, and then add load from there. Looking at another example of a progression, we'll have a look at the deadlift now. So down the bottom here. So if the base version is a barbell deadlift, then you can actually change the exercise to make a progression, as shown in the diagram here, which would be a single leg version instead. Now, if you're making it a single leg version, it would be a lower weight than what the person can do with a normal deadlift movement pattern. So in terms of the load, it's actually a regression. But because the balance component is much more difficult for the client to achieve, the correct exercise technique on a single leg only, it's considered an overall progression. So while it's a lighter weight, it's a far more difficult exercise, so therefore it's a progression. Now let's look at some regressions now on the flip side. So when the base movements are too difficult for the client and we've put them through the paces in those movements and they can't, achieve an ideal movement pattern, then we need to look at some regressions. So let's look at the squat again. So if we want to make a squat regressed or make it an easier version, we can target much of the same muscle mass in a leg press. Now this is a regression because obviously the machine is, helping to stabilize the movement for the client. But you still achieve the same sort of benefits in terms of targeting the same muscle mass. You might also look at reducing the range of motion. So if they can't squat to a particular depth, we might raise that depth for them until they can achieve the right movement pattern that we're looking for. And then in the deadlift as well, you might have someone not even lift the weight initially. So to teach someone, the right starting position for a deadlift, you might even have them just hold that position, a static position for a number of seconds and build that time up gradually until they're able to really nail down that starting position of the deadlift. And then eventually from there, you might look at increasing that exercise difficulty by making them actually lift the weight. And here we have some more common exercise selections that are provided in your step-by-step PDF resource. So we're not going to spend too much time going through all of these, but just be aware that you can go into this PDF file and sort of find out a lot of different progressions and regressions from some common movements and common exercise selections that you can use within your own programming. The next component we're going to look at is going to be volume. So volume just looks at how much work your client does within their exercise or within their sessions or within their overall program. So it can actually refer to the total volume within a single exercise session. So the way we work this out would be the number of sets multiplied by the number of reps. For example, if we had 8 different exercises and 3 sets of 10 of each, it'd be 8 times 3 times 10, which would be a total volume of 240 repetitions for that session. Volume can also refer to the total amount of weight lifted. So within a session, this would be the number of sets multiplied by the number of reps, multiply the number of weights lifted in each set. So one exercise example could be 3 sets of 10 barbell squats at 80 kilograms each. So 3 lots of 10 multiplied by 80 would be 2,400 kilos lifted in that exercise. Volume can also finally refer to a total weekly volume. And this is how much exercise is performed within the week. This could be the total number of minutes or a total session volume multiplied the number of sessions per week, so the frequency of the sessions. So how do we determine what is a suitable volume for a client? Basically, we do this depending on a number of different factors. So the first one will be the client's preferences. So how long do they want their session to go for? Or how many times a week are they actually available to train? How much can they afford to pay you essentially if you're doing one-on-one sessions as well? Next, we'd have their fitness levels. So would the client be more suitable to do 1 to 2 sets per exercise as a beginner? Or can they take on a higher volume of training because they're more advanced or experienced with exercise? And then finally, we've got the client's goals. So if the client's goal is strength, then we saw on one of the previous slides that generally for strength-related goals, they'll perform 3 to 5 sets of a lower repetition number per set. And then if their goal is muscular endurance, they'll generally perform a higher number of repetitions per set, possibly 15 or more. So all these components will impact on your ability to determine what a suitable volume is for your client. Step number 3 is all about determining what a suitable session duration and volume is. We've discussed what volume is on the previous slide, so let's look at now how can we find what the right numbers are for our client. Well, these numbers are going to be heavily influenced by the phases and duration of the session. So let's have a look at these. So the first one is your preparation phase, or usually also called the warm-up. And this is normally 5 to 10% of the total session duration. So in a 30-minute session, this could be anywhere from sort of 3 to 5 minutes. Then we have the body of the session, so the main workout phase, which is the conditioning phase. And this is where we're doing, the most important part of the program, the actual exercises that we're programming. And these are specific to the client's goals. Then finally, we have the recovery phase, or also referred to as the cool down. And again, this is 5 to 10% of the total session. And it might even be we give them some extra stretching or some homework to do before their next training session. We also have some other factors that will significantly influence your choices when choosing a suitable session volume. So first of all, the length of the conditioning phase. So a 30-minute exercise session may contain, anywhere from a 2 to 5 minute warm-up and 2 to 5 minute cool down. And this leaves about anywhere from, 22 to 25 minutes sort of area left in the actual conditioning phase of the program. So you've got that amount of time to actually write the exercises that you want them to do. Now, if we compare this to a 45-minute session, they may spend, a bit longer in the warm-up, so maybe 4 minutes in the warm-up and 4 minutes in the cool down. And that gives you a total of around 37 minutes or thereabouts available for you to choose some conditioning exercises. So you've got more time there in a longer session duration, so you get more capacity to give them more volume of exercise. Now, required rest. This refers to the rest they'll do in between sets or in between exercises as they're changing. So you must account for the amount of time that this client will be resting for within each set and in between exercises, because this is time that is taken from the total session duration, and it's time that contributes towards the conditioning phase. So if we think about strength exercises, so high intensity, low repetitions, they require up to 3 to 5 minutes of rest in between sets to allow the client to appropriately recover so they can repeat that high intensity effort next time. So if you're resting for up to 5 minutes in between sets, that's a significant chunk of your conditioning phase that is being spent on resting. But just consider how long your rest periods are and how much that takes, how much time that takes up within the conditioning phase. Then we have the exercise type. So with the exercise type, what we want to consider here is that unilateral exercises, so those that are performed on one limb at a time. So if you're doing, lunges, for example, they take up approximately twice the amount of time for the same number of reps as bilateral movements. So like a squat. So with the lunge, obviously you have to work both sides, both legs. So you'll change that, which leg is in front and which leg is behind, and repeat the exercise. It takes up almost twice the amount of time as a normal exercise would do that's done on both legs or both arms at the same time. Then we have the number of repetitions. So how many repetitions will be performed in a set needs to be considered, because the higher the number of repetitions within a set, the longer each set takes to complete. So you might have, one set that's 15 repetitions versus one that's 8 repetitions, and approximately the 8 repetition set will take about half the time that the 15 repetition set would take. Then we have the number of sets. Obviously, the higher the number of sets, the longer the exercise takes before you change to the next exercise. And that is another factor that will contribute to how much time you've got available within the rest of your conditioning phase. And then finally, we've got the client's skills or client's capabilities. So a less experienced client may require additional time in actually being taught the exercise and being cued and corrected. And again, that takes up time of your conditioning phase that you need to account for. So we've got an example here of how to estimate session duration within a session. And so there's a lot of numbers on the page here. So what we're going to do is just simplify it a little bit and look at one exercise. So we'll do the bench press. So we've got a bench press. It's programmed for 3 sets of 15 repetitions. The tempo of the set or the repetition is a 3-1-3 format, which means we spend 3 seconds in the concentric phase, a 1 second pause, and then a 3 seconds in the eccentric phase. So it's basically just talking about 3 seconds on the way down, a pause, 3 seconds on the way up. So we know, because there's that allocation of time, it's going to be 7 seconds per each repetition in that set. So we've counted for that here. So 7 seconds multiplied by 15 reps is approximately 105 seconds it would take just to do the exercise itself. But then we must also account for the rest in between the sets. So if it's programmed for 60 seconds, then that's a total of 3 minutes that will be spent resting in the bench press exercise. So what we want to do then is add those two different components together. So the amount of time it takes to do the exercise, and we add that to the amount of rest we spend during the exercise. And those two numbers here, so 3 multiplied by 105 seconds, which is the rest, total set time and rest time, or 3 by 60 seconds, we have a total of almost 500 seconds just to do that one exercise. So we can see here, if we repeat that process across the 4 exercises, so they've all got the same variables of 3 lots of 15, so they all take the same amount of time. We add them all up, it's 1980 seconds, which is 33 minutes. So just to do those 4 exercises, it's 33 minutes So we then have to look at, how long does the warm up and how long does the cool down add to that time. And for this particular session, it's going to take approximately 45 minutes to get that amount of work actually done. So just sort of be aware of how much you're programming and how much time you've got available, and will your program fit within the allocated time frame. Now on to step number 4, which is about determining the type of exercise we give to our clients. The first thing we must consider when we determine the type of exercise is the overall concept of specificity. And this refers to each client having their own individual needs within a program. So one of these will be what the client's actual goal is. So the goal is one of the main components that will influence your choice of exercise selection. Some additional components that we need to also factor in is the client's medical history. So do they have any chronic conditions or injuries that we might seek guidance from a medical or allied health professional to obtain some advice about what sort of programming guidelines we need to follow for that person? What is their current fitness level? So a person with a low level can obviously do a lot of different exercise to someone with a high fitness level. Then we've got their fitness testing results. So when we put the client through their first initial fitness test, it gives us a good idea of what their current fitness level is. And then we use that information to influence their initial programming. So with low fitness testing results, we give them an easier or regressed exercise program. And then we've got their mobility. So we put someone through a movement screen and they can't perform an exercise with correct technique through the full range of motion that we'd like them to, then obviously we need to make a consideration there and possibly look at regressing that exercise. So when we choose different exercise, we must know what the benefits are of doing that exercise in the first place, because then it helps us to relate, those benefits to the client's goals. So each client will present you with different goals, and then we must determine what's the most suitable type of exercise to meet that goal. And understanding the benefits of different exercise types helps us to do that. So let's go through some of these different exercise types as well as the key benefits. So we'll start with resistance training first. And we've learned from previous slides that compound exercises are those that use large muscle groups and multiple muscle groups and have more than one moving joints. And usually they're exercises that stimulate a real life activity. And so therefore they are functional or more functional. Some of the key benefits of resistance compound exercises are they use more muscle groups, so they're more effective and more efficient way of helping clients to achieve their goals because we're using more muscle groups, we're burning more calories, for example. Because we're using more muscle groups and more joints, we're building more of those beneficial adaptations like strength and power and muscular endurance. We're also more beneficial at helping to achieve weight management outcomes. So this just links back to we're burning more kilojoules when we're doing these exercises because there's more muscles involved. Therefore, if the client's goal is weight management, then it's more effective for them as well. And overall, I guess with any exercise, but I guess probably more in compound resistance training than versus isolation, we help to reduce risk of diseases or other health conditions developing. Moving on to isolation now. So these are those contrasting exercises where we're using usually smaller muscle groups and only one moving joint. So the reason why we might choose this over compound training is that we can help to focus on one very specific area or muscle group or joint when we choose these movements. It also can be a good way to build confidence for new clients and beginners to exercise because they are comparatively easy to learn and to do them initially. So that can help build confidence for those people. We can help to isolate single joints as well. So if we've identified a muscle imbalance or It's been diagnosed by an allied health professional, for example. It can also be a good way to learn part of a different movement pattern. So we can, simplify the movement, build some strength in that simplified movement before moving them on to a compound exercise. We also use them as a regression from compound movements that are too difficult for clients to achieve. And finally, we can use them as well to provide more general stability in a movement across a lever system. And our final type of resistance training we'll look at is isometric. And isometric exercises are where there's little to no muscle movement in the actual exercise itself. So the muscle is actually contracting, but the muscle length isn't changing. So the body part or body position doesn't move. This is also known as static movement or static exercise. And a good example would be a plank or a wall sit. Some of the key benefits of this exercise type are that can it help stabilize key areas or improve strength in key areas. It can improve strength within a specific range of motion. So if a client isn't ready to progress to a full range of motion, we might have them hold one position. And that sort of alludes to our final point. It's beneficial when certain range of motions are difficult or not possible for the client to achieve. And then across resistance training in general, the benefits include improving our muscle strength, power, endurance, as well as being very beneficial for bone density. Can help manage blood pressure and blood sugar levels, can help manage our body composition. Like any exercise, they help to reduce risk of disease or health conditions from developing. Very good for posture, where there's postural deviations. Can help with joint pain, and finally can also help reduce stress. And now we'll finish up with flexibility exercise. Some of the key benefits here will be increasing joint range of motion, helping to reduce tension, and it's often the exercise type we use to program our warm-ups and our cool-downs. And finally, cardiovascular exercise, which is just defined as any movement that requires, large muscle involvement and recruitment and contraction over a sustained period of time. So these are exercises that elevate the heart rate. So things like walking and running and rowing and things of that nature. So a lot of the benefits to cardiovascular exercise are similar to resistance. The main ones are that might differentiate it slightly from resistance will be increasing a person's VO2 max, which is a measure of their aerobic capacity. It's very effective at helping to reduce resting heart rate. It can also help with improving our stroke volume, which is the amount of blood we can eject from the heart per beat. And just like resistance training, it's very effective at helping to reduce our risk of diseases and health conditions from developing. Very good for weight management and body composition. And finally, the improvements to our mental health. So in terms of helping to control our stress and anxiety levels are also well established. With step 4, we looked at how do we determine what the right type of exercise is for our client. In step 5 now, we determine what equipment we need to use to implement the exercise that we've already chosen. And there's a wide variety of different choices when it comes to exercise equipment. And, with each year, we have new innovative pieces of machinery or equipment that's developed and released into the industry, which is pretty cool. So how do we find out what is the best options to use? Well, first of all, we need to consider if the equipment will work within the layout of the space that we actually got available to us, and how this will ultimately affect the program's efficiency. Now, by efficiency, we refer to how easy it is for you to actually set up each exercise, as well as transition from one to the next. So you need to consider the time taken to change the weights on barbells, for example, and how much time that would add up to if you're doing multiple barbell movements within one session. Also consider the time it would take to transition from one exercise to the next. So if you've got 4 or 5 different movements planned, they're in different parts of the gym, you need to factor in how long it takes for you to move to that new location, as well as set up that new exercise if that's what it requires. But in terms of exercise and the equipment available to you, there's a lot of choices. So we can do just body weight movements by itself with no exercise, or we can transition through some of the different machines or equipment we've got available to us. So whether that's bands, pin loaded machines, cable machines, free weights like dumbbells and kettlebells, barbells, as well as cardiovascular machines. So your choice amongst these different types of equipment will be heavily influenced based on the type of exercise that matches your client's goals. So if their goal is to be able to do a 10K run, obviously we're going to use more cardiovascular machine programming or cardiovascular exercises themselves instead of pin-loaded machines or free weights. Now, step number 6 is about how do we, put the fine tuning on our program? What are some of the overload methods and drills we can adopt? And these refer to some of the different training techniques or styles of training that we can use to help guide our program and session delivery. So when it comes to, first of all, cardiovascular exercise, there's 2 main types of training here that we'd be interested in doing. So the first one is continuous cardiovascular exercise. So this is exercise that is done at a relatively constant pace and constant intensity without rest periods, and usually for a long period of time. So example of one of these would be having your client do a 5K run on the treadmill at 7 kilometers per hour, something like that. So it's a relatively constant speed and intensity, and it's something they can maintain for a long period of time. Now, in contrast to this, we have interval training. So this is exercise that is done in short bursts of very high intensity exercise, but often is followed by the same amount of time spent resting. So for interval training to be effective, you really need to have the intensity quite high, because if they're just doing, a moderate intensity exercise for 30 seconds and then resting for 30 seconds, that's going to be very easy for them to perform. And the benefits from interval training come at really working at that high intensity. And the reason why we have sort of similar or equal working periods to rest periods is that because the exercise itself is quite a high intensity, we need a significant amount of rest to be able to repeat that next set and do, multiple intervals. Moving on from there, if we're looking at resistance training, some of the techniques we can use, obviously using, free weights with gym equipment itself or with body weight. And then finally with flexibility, there's 2 main types here. We've got dynamic flexibility, and that means exercise uses your joints through their full range of motion. And usually this is a good way to warm up a client through dynamic flexibility. It could be things like, arm swings or leg swings, for example. And then you have static flexibility, which is more traditionally used as a cool down method. And that just looks at, just holding a constant static position while we're lengthening a muscle group and getting a stretch on that target area. Spend some time now going through some of the different overload methods and drills we can use to help guide our programming. Now, a lot of these are techniques that we might not use as the main, primary component of a client's program. We might use these as something on the side as a conjunctive programming type, or we might use it every now and then to help promote some beneficial adaptations to occur. Now, the reason why you would do a lot of these, and before we go into the details of what they are specifically, is what we're trying to do is to promote beneficial improvements in the client. And when we're looking at things like muscle growth, there's a few components that heavily influence the extent to which a muscle can grow. One of these is the tension we apply to the muscle. So if we think about the load we put it through, if we're lifting a weight. One of these is metabolic stress. And we can think about metabolic stress as, when we're breaking down our macronutrients, so our proteins and fats and carbohydrates, as part of that process, they produce metabolites. So you don't need to know too much about that, but just be aware of these are the chemical processes that are going on every time we do exercise and weight training and things like that. And as these metabolites accumulate, because we're doing repeated sets and repeated exercises, that contributes to metabolic stress. And the more metabolic stress there is, the more we have to adapt to that. And then the final component that also influences things like muscle gain is muscle damage itself. So what we're trying to do is create these really small damage to the muscles we're using in a session. And then as we repair and recover from that session, as long as we're not, providing a stimulus that's too great or too much damage, then that's another way our muscles can respond, recover, and adapt to exercise. So some of these techniques are quite good at promoting some of those things, whether it's that really small muscle damage, some metabolic stress, as well as getting some more tension into the exercise as well by doing more exercise within a session. And the first way we can do that is through supersetting. The supersetting, you might be familiar with this already, but we most commonly see this as two exercises that are performed back to back without rest. And when we implement this, it's usually done as a push-pull combination or an upper and lower body combination, so that we're using different muscle groups in those two exercises back to back. But we can perform this with the same muscle groups if you really want to, fatigue a particular muscle group, but it just depends on how you want to implement that. As we go through these, you'll see on the right-hand side column, there are some considerations to make or some recommendations of what to avoid. So if you'd like to read through those, you can do so by pausing the slide or reading the PDF version of this presentation. Moving down to drop sets. So this is a technique where we would complete a set or rep number that's predetermined, and then we gradually reduce the exercise intensity in following sets until your client can't do any more. So if you might see this in the gym, someone doing maybe bicep curls, for example. So they might start on the 20 kilo weights, they do 10 reps, put the weights back straight away, move into the 17.5 kilo weights, do as many as they can, and move their weight down until they literally cannot bend their elbow anymore because there's been so much fatigue build up, metabolic stress, and that they don't have the capacity to generate energy anymore and repeat that muscle contraction or repeat that movement. And it's a really good way of encouraging muscle gain because we're getting a really high volume of exercise in within a short time period, and we're getting a significant fatigue response as well. So you can sort of think about drop sets as, potentially multiple supersets back to back, but targeting the same muscle groups. Now with these, it is really important to consider that if you are doing a, compound lift, maybe a bench press or dumbbell press or something like that, because we are really fatiguing those muscle groups and we have a weight potentially over our body or over our head almost, we might want to have a spotter for safety. Then our third overload method at the bottom here is pre-fatiguing. This is where we would involve exhausting certain smaller muscle groups usually before targeting a larger muscle group. And can also include using single joint exercises before going for multiple joint exercises. So if, for example, we really want to target pectoralis major, which we would often do in any upper body press movement, so like dumbbell press, bench press, that sort of thing. And we want to take away some of the involvement of the triceps, which are a synergist muscle in that exercise, so the muscle on the back of your arms. We might pre-fatigue the triceps so that we're really focusing and targeting on pectoralis major when we go ahead and do that bench press or that chest press. So to implement that, you might do a series of tricep exercises, so tricep push downs, for example, and then get into your bench press. If you're doing that, obviously because you have a muscle group that helps with that movement already fatigued, generally the weight you go to lift when you go and do that compound movement will be lower than if that muscle wasn't fatigued already. So it's just something to consider if you're looking at doing pre-fatiguing. Next, we have plyometric training. And this will involve a lot of jumping exercises, a lot of, rapid power generation type movements. So they put in a maximum force in a short duration of time. And yeah, therefore it's a very power focused movement with rapid muscle contractions. So we must consider if this is suitable for our clients, especially if they have, joint pain, for example. Arthritis would be a good example of that. Whether or not we want to do, rapid muscle contractions with a lot of impact when they're landing. So just think about if it's suitable for your client before you adopt those. But they are quite effective at improving power. So a lot of sports specific application there. And then we have on the bottom circuit training. So you're probably familiar with this one already, but it involves basically going through a series of 5 to 10 exercises, or it could be any number really, that target various muscle groups. And it's usually structured in a way that there's very little to no rest in between each exercise, apart from, moving to the next station perhaps. And it's quite effective at improving, cardiovascular outcomes as well as resistance as well. So if you think about if you did, say, 5 resistance movements in a row with no rest in between, obviously you're getting the musculoskeletal benefits there, but you're also elevating your heart rate and you're sustaining an elevated heart rate throughout the duration of the circuit. So you're kind of achieving both cardiovascular and resistance benefits from that method. Now with circuit training, and actually across all of these, because we are trying to get usually more exercise into a shorter period of time or the same period of time, we will usually see higher levels of fatigue. So we want to make sure that we don't sacrifice form for the sake of doing more movement. So we always want to make sure that the weights the clients are lifting or the intensity the exercises are conducted at is a suitable level that they can still maintain their proper form during those exercise techniques. Then next we have interval training. So interval training involves periods of high intensity, and it has to be high intensity, in short bursts, so short periods of time, followed by longer rest periods or less intense exercises or rest. So we can do this a number of ways. It could be, for example, if you're looking at a body weight movement, so maybe 30 seconds of a burpee, followed by 30 seconds of rest, no exercise at all. Or it could be 30 seconds of burpees, followed by a low intensity exercise, just like marching on the spot, for example. There's a lot of different ways you can get creative with those, but the key emphasis will be that when they're working, when they're doing their set, it has to be a high intensity for the interval to be effective. So what we're looking at when we're doing interval training in terms of considerations is you're not going to jump straight into it. You need to make sure the client has a proper warm-up, because any time where we're exposing them to a high intensity movement, and often interval exercises are high impact as well, we want to make sure the body is appropriately warmed up. And again, maintaining proper form during exercise. And our final step after we've put it all together is to run the program and then trial it for effectiveness. So the things we want to look at here are the timings, first of all. So questions to ask would be, did the session run on schedule or under time or overtime? And if it did, what can you do to fix that? Can you take something out? Can you add something in? And have you given yourself enough time to actually include the coaching of the exercises within the program as well? And that's more applicable to new clients when they're learning exercises. And then look at the intensity as well. So is it suitable for your client? Ask them for their feedback. Was it too difficult? Was it too easy? And then use that information to refine the program and then repeat that process. So implement the changes, ask for feedback, and you'll continually go through that cycle. But what you're looking for is feedback on any variable of the program. So did they like the exercises? Was the intensity suitable? Are they doing too much within the time frame? Could they do more throughout the week or less throughout the week? So any variable of the program itself, gain feedback on that, and then use that to shape the next program you write for that client or next session you write for that client. Now we've gone through all the steps involved in writing a program, let's put all that into practice with a case study example. Now the scenario provided on the screen here is actually very similar to how many of your assessment questions are written when you're required to write programs. So often you'll be given information about a client, their age, their medical background, and their goals. And from that information, you have to develop a program for them. So we'll use that same structure and do that with an example within this presentation. So the client we're looking at is a female aged 38. Now nice and easy because there's no known medical conditions or injuries to be aware of. She's a beginner to gym-based exercise and she's currently doing 2 5K runs per week. So she's getting enough cardiovascular training in throughout the week, but she wants to start some resistance training as well. So the goals are therefore to begin and safely commence a resistance training program for this individual. And the preferences are 1 45-minute session per week. So what we need to do is use all this information and establish an overall goal for this client and highlight all the key points. So first of all, she's only available to train 1 session per week, and there's 45 minutes available for that session. The intensity we'll discuss on the next slide, so we'll skip over that one for now. The type is going to be total body resistance training, so using large muscle groups, upper and lower body and that sort of thing, just to introduce them to that type of training. And the time available is 45 minutes for the session. So how do we choose an intensity for this client? Where do we start? What's suitable and what isn't? So we need to base this on the client's goal, for one, and the current fitness level, secondly. So the goal is to safely commence a resistance training program, but a fitness level is a beginner to gym-based exercise. So those two things will heavily influence your choice here with what is a suitable intensity. So if you want to have a go now and see if you can use that information and pick from the table on the right which sort of range or which number you think would be suitable for this client, and just pause your presentation to do so. Okay, if you've done that, let's have a look at what would be the best place to start. So, endurance is a great place to start, muscular endurance, for beginner clients. So this is the range between 50 to 65% 1 repetition maximum. And it's a good place to start because it's a lower intensity, it's a lower weight being lifted. So it's a more gradual introduction to resistance training. So why would strength or maximal strength not be suitable here? Well, basically it's not suitable for beginners to this type of training. It's a very heavy stimulus, and they're probably somebody who doesn't know how to do the correct technique straight away. So if we combine those two things, so a heavy load and poor technique, then we expose them to an unnecessary risk for injury. Now, hypertrophy is another area you could potentially look at, so 66 to 83% 1 repetition maximum. But it would depend on the type or the number of the intensity you chose here. So at the lower end, 66% and up, it's very similar loads compared to endurance. But if you compare 66% to 83% 1 repetition maximum, that's a significant difference in the load being lifted. So perhaps the lower end of hypertrophy could be appropriate here. But just in general, if someone's doing a new type of exercise, especially for resistance training, then you might start them at a lower intensity range, such as muscular endurance, to help reduce the risk of injury and expose them gradually to that exercise type before increasing intensity over a period of time. So now we've established a suitable intensity for this client, we must then match it to the number of repetitions. So muscular endurance is a good place to start for this client, but muscular endurance spans across 50% 1RM up to 65% 1RM. So which number do we choose in here? Which one's the most suitable for this client? Now for this client, we consider there's no known medical conditions. They are relatively active already. So this case, we've gone for 65% 1RM, which is on the upper end of that muscular endurance range. So next we need to match the repetition number to the intensity we've chosen. And it's a simple process for this client. There's no reason why we need to do anything crazy here. So in this case, we're just going to match it straight up to 15. So 65% 1RM, we can see 15 repetitions are possible. So they're the training variables that we will go with. Now, why we didn't choose a different intensity number, like a lower number such as 50% 1RM, is because if you look at the number of repetitions possible at 50%, it's 20 plus. So we're actually going to spend a lot of time doing each set if we're doing 20 or more repetitions. So that's going to eat up into how much we can actually do within the session. So the benefit of choosing a slightly higher intensity here at 65 means we don't have to do as many repetitions to achieve the improvements we're looking for. Now, should we always match our intensity to our repetitions? In most cases, in the vast majority of cases, we would do so. We would always match the intensity number to the number of repetitions. However, if you had a very deconditioned client, so maybe they're doing a brand new type of exercise or exercise, in the first place, we might choose a lower repetition number for a given intensity. And we do that for a number of reasons. So we want to gradually introduce them to the exercise. We don't want it to be too difficult for them to do initially so that, they don't even come back for a second session because they were so sore the next day or something like that. So you could play around with the repetition numbers there, but you wouldn't go significantly lower than what is recommended in this table. So for example, in the program we're writing for this client, we went 65% 1 RM and it only gave them, 8 reps or fewer. Then that's going to be an issue because it's going to be too easy for the client to do each exercise. And because it's so easy, we're not really promoting any metabolic stress on the body or on the muscle tissue. We're not really getting that muscle damage that is then repaired to promote beneficial adaptations before the next session. So we want to find a balance of giving them something that's not too easy and something that's not outside of their capacity as well. Now, a bit of a special note here. If you are programming a body weight exercise, you don't actually use percentage of 1 RM to indicate intensity there. So if it's body weight, obviously there's no additional resistance apart from the body. So we can't use 1 RM because 1 RM is only used when we're loading the body with an external stimulus like a dumbbell, a barbell, whatever it is. So if you're programming a body weight exercise, all you need to do is write in the intensity column BW or body weight. Usually BW fits a lot nicer in there because it's a pretty narrow column usually. Now that we've worked out our intensity and our repetition numbers, we must now work out what our sets and rests need to be. So we've got this table on the slide here on the right-hand side, and it gives you some good guidelines to follow when determining these variables. So we're working within the endurance range. So if we follow that across and have a look at the number of sets and number of rests, then what we can do is use those numbers that are established there. So it does say 1 to 2 plus sets for your endurance range. So I've actually gone with 3 here. And 3 is a good number, especially for a new program, because you're giving the chance for the client to do that movement, 3 different sets of 15 repetitions to really nail down that movement pattern and get it, fine-tuned and mastered across that time frame. If you just picked 1 or 2 sets, it might be a bit difficult for them to get enough practice in and really nail that movement pattern down. So we've gone with 3 here. And 3 is also good because we've got 45 minutes to work within. If it was a much shorter session, we might do fewer sets, but we should be able to fit enough volume of exercise into 45 minutes with 3 sets per exercise. Then in terms of rest, the recommendations are 30 to 60 seconds. And we've gone with 60 seconds here on the upper end because it's a client that's doing this type of exercise for the first time. So we don't want to be too short on the rest periods because it might not give the chance for the client to recover enough between each set because they're not conditioned for this exercise type. Now we know our overall program variables, so our sets, our reps, our rests, and our intensity. We must then pick the exercises that we're going to fit into the conditioning phase of the program. So we've got some choices to make. Do we want to go with compound or do we want to go with isolation movements here? And you can recall from the earlier slides in this presentation that compound exercises are generally far more effective because they recruit more significant muscle mass and involve movements where multiple joints are involved, as opposed to isolation, which usually only involves smaller muscle groups and a single moving joint. So this means that the vast majority of exercises that we choose for this client should come from a compound basis where possible. Using isolation exercise for this client is especially important considering they only have one 45-minute session to perform throughout the week. So if we spend a lot of that time with isolation movements, so small muscle groups, single moving joints, then we're not providing the most effective means for them to reach their goals. So we're giving them a less efficient exercise type. Then we also need to decide which muscle groups we want to target. So in this case, should we look at doing an all upper body session or all lower body or something else altogether? So the client preferences, if we look back at those, is just to begin a programming resistance-based session once per week. Doesn't mention that she wants to do only upper body or only lower body. So for this case, we would choose a variety of upper and lower. And this is a good way to provide a more effective program for this client. Now, reasons why you might not do this, might not do a full body session, instead do all upper or all lower, is people sometimes have very specific body composition goals, and they might have more capacity to fit in exercise throughout the week. So if someone wants to do, 5 or 6 training sessions per week, they're not all going to be, total body sessions. They're going to be specific body regions. So upper or lower split programs might fit better there. But for this client, we want to sort of hit on all those major muscle groups, and we've only got one session per week to do it. So let's do a full body session instead. So we've got a selection of exercises here. And across all of these movements, we are focusing on all major muscle groups. So what we're trying to do is essentially get the most bang for the client's buck in terms of promoting all the beneficial adaptations in the body that we can, so the client can progress towards their goal most effectively and also safely. So our first exercise selection in the list involves some very significant muscle recruitment, and it's a really good functional exercise, and that being, of course, the squat. Now for this exercise, because the client is a beginner, we might just choose to have them do, just really focus on the body weight squat version before we begin to load them up in the future with some resistance in the form of a dumbbell or barbell or anything that adds an external load. It's really important for people to master basic movement patterns before we start adding a load, especially with some of the more complex lifts. So the squat is quite complex. There's a lot of moving joints, a lot of muscle groups involved. So we want to make sure they can do it properly before we start to load them up. Now it's fairly likely or potential that because this client is fairly active, that they will pick it up quite quickly. So, all that running, while it's a different type of exercise, it might transfer over to the way their body moves and how quickly they can pick an exercise up. And so we might progress them quite quickly in terms of adding a load to this client. And we do that usually through dumbbell versions, progressively increasing in weight before moving to barbell versions. And as long as they can perform that exercise with the desired range of motion, then they should be able to then progress to adding load. So we've got the squat in here already, and it's a body weight version. So we've chosen BW for intensity. And we've got the program set with variables of 3 sets of 15 repetitions for 60 seconds rest in between. So based on how the movement looked, we could then potentially might need to change some of those variables. You might need to change rest periods. It might be, number of repetitions. So you need to look at the feedback from your client, how they're performing the exercise, and then decide to make a change. It could even be that they can't do the range of motion that you want them to. So you might have them, squat onto a box that's a little bit higher than what they were currently doing before. So now let's look at our second exercise, and it would be ideal to choose an upper body movement here. And this would allow some extra time for the lower body muscles that they use in the squat to recover while they're performing a different exercise altogether. And generally, this is a really good strategy for beginners to rotate muscle groups. So let's stick on the theme of push exercises and do a good upper body push movement, and also recruit some significant muscle mass. That would be some sort of chest press dumbbell press or press type movement. Now in this case, because the client is a beginner, it might be ideal to start them on some sort of machine-based chest press, where the movement is relatively controlled for them by the machine. And from there, you'd look at progressing them onto dumbbell versions or barbell versions once they've built up a bit of baseline strength and coordination, and then progress them to that point. So the chest press machine has been programmed with the same sort of variables, but because it's a weighted movement, we're using 65% 1 RM to indicate the intensity. It's a little bit different to the body weight intensity we saw in the squat. For our next exercise, down to number 3, we're going with another lower body movement. So again, we're rotating body segments and muscle groups to allow for recovery in between. And perhaps the most effective lower body pull exercise is going to be some sort of deadlift or deadlift variation. Now, some people really struggle to pick up the deadlift movement pattern. So it's likely that if you're teaching this to a new client for the first time, it might take you a significant portion of the session, or potentially even multiple sessions, for them to really get it right and pick it up. It could be a good idea to start with some sort of dumbbell-based deadlift to begin with, depending on their ability levels. And the reason why the deadlift is such an effective exercise is due to the significant muscle recruitment that's involved, as well as the many different joints that are moving in this particular exercise. So if we look at it in more detail, we've got significant muscle activation in the glutes, the hamstrings predominantly, but we also have some involvement from the quadriceps as well. And we're also engaging those spinal support muscles that sort of integrate around the vertebrae themselves and extend up and down the spine. Choosing a dumbbell here, or dumbbell version, will mean that the weight lifted is going to be somewhat less than a traditional barbell deadlift. But over time, as they master the movement pattern, you can progress them onto the barbell variation. Number 4, we want to move away from the lower body and rotate back up to the upper body. And we've got the chest press already. So let's look for an opposing movement for balance and some sort of upper body pull movement. So a good place to start here might be some kind of row. And there's dozens, if not more, of individual versions of a row movement you could include. So it could be a seated row machine or a dumbbell row, a barbell row, for example. So choose one based on who the client is and what their background is. So for this one here, we might start with a seated row, which is a machine-based exercise, and it's a good place to start because it helps to control the movement for them. Now, the seated row is not to be confused with a rowing machine, which is obviously a cardiovascular exercise, but we're not programming cardio here. We're doing resistance training only. Now, number 5, if you have a 45-minute session, there's a good chance that if you're doing 3 sets of each exercise, you'll likely have time for another movement, so a 5th exercise. Now the client's doing enough cardiovascular training already, so we want to follow their goals of doing a resistance-based program. So in this case here, there's really a lot of different things you could do in terms of which muscle groups you want to target. But we're not doing any overhead movements at the moment. So for that reason, I've chosen the machine overhead press. Now, overhead movements are generally something people don't pick up as well as other movements. So we've got the machine version to help control the motion, get them used to pushing overhead. And over time, you could look at progressing that into a free weight version, whether that's dumbbell or barbell overhead press. So across all these exercises, we've given them the same intensity in sets, reps, and rest. And that's a really important concept for a program, is to keep it consistent across all exercises. So there's no real reason, especially for this client, to have different intensities and different rep numbers because the client has the same goal. There's no medical background. There's no reason or guidance given to give a certain muscle group a lower intensity. So if we keep everything consistent, then we can help create balance within a program. When we start to play around and have different intensities and different rep numbers, we can actually promote muscular imbalance over time, because when we're doing that, we might be favoring one muscle group over another. And that, like I just mentioned, can lead to muscle imbalance. So if you've chosen an intensity and rep number, it's really important to be consistent across all exercises for that reason. Now, finally, let's have a look at determining the different session phases and volume within those. And we've already looked at programming the conditioning phase, which we did on the previous slides. So the exercises and the intensity and the reps and things of that nature, it's already done. We need to make sure now that it's all going to fit within 45-minute session duration, because we also have a lot of other things we need to put into our program, including the warm-up as well as the cool-down. So on the table on your screen here is taken directly from the step-by-step programming PDF version of this presentation. And here it says that our warm-up and warm-up and cool-down phases will be approximately 5 to 10% of the total session duration. So we need to allocate approximately 3 to 5 minutes for each of those. In terms of what we would include in a warm-up, now briefly this would be movements like dynamic flexibility, or you might choose to include some very low intensity weighted exercises. But just make sure the intensity is below the level within the conditioning phase itself. And if you're programming dynamic flexibility, and examples of these would be like leg swings and arm swings, you generally want to focus on the muscle groups that are being targeted within the session itself. For the cool down, this could be a number of different things as well. It could be some static flexibility exercises like stretching. But you may have a low intensity aerobic activity the client can perform, but generally you do that only in the scenario where you're actually programming a cardiovascular session. So most of the time, cool downs will be some sort of flexibility exercise, but you do have an option of having a low intensity cardio exercise as well, just to help remove some of the waste products of exercise and gradually return the heart rate to resting levels. Now, overall, through this example, we've covered the basics to follow for step-by-step programming. But for more detailed information, please refer to the PDF of this presentation that you'll find within any cluster or within any unit that requires programming to be written. So in there, you'll find all the tables that you've seen in these slides, and some sections will contain more in-depth information than what we've covered here as well. In this example, we've also shown how to put that into practice with this client we're programming for now. And you would follow those same steps when writing programs in your assessments, regardless of who the program is for, whatever the client's background is, or the type of session that you're programming. Follow the same steps, and you're well on your way to writing effective programs for clients. I hope you found this presentation helpful, and thanks for watching.